John Venus is someone who's been a leader in the vegan movement, an advocate for veganism here on YouTube for many years. We find out today that he's given up on eating a vegan diet. He's given up on the vegan movement because of misconceptions he still struggles with about what's natural, necessary, and normal. To put it in different words, I would say that he's still really burdened with misconceptions about what the ethical implications of evolution are for how we're living here and now today. It's a deep issue. It's a real issue. It may be something you personally struggled with in the past, whoever you are watching the video, maybe something you're struggling with now. But if not, I can really guarantee there are people in your life, whether they're ex-vegans, non-vegans, your grandparents, aunts, uncles, there will be people who struggle with this issue. It's deep. It's difficult to live with the implications of the simple truth of this issue. And it's not something that I think we should dismiss in a kind of shallow, catty way as just being an appeal to nature fallacy.
A logical fallacy is an error in logic or reasoning that makes an argument unreasonable. An appeal to nature fallacy is used when somebody argues that their side is correct or good because something is natural, or something is bad or incorrect because it is unnatural. Just because something is natural or found in nature does not mean it is justified or good. An example of something natural that is bad is a hurricane. A hurricane is a natural phenomenon. However, that does not mean that they are a good thing.
Discussions about logical fallacies can sometimes be useful, but very often they're a thought-terminating cliche. They're a cliche people throw into the conversation that then stops either party from really thinking deeply or seriously about what the topic is at hand.
This is not something that I, as a parent, as a father, am comfortable with doing. I'm not comfortable of dismissing, hundreds of thousands of years or even millions of years of a certain, eating pattern. And
I am very familiar with the last 5,000 years of human history. I'm not really all that familiar with the last, say, 5 million years. I've never been interested in archaeology and physical anthropology on that scale. But just in the last 5,000 years, you can become profoundly acquainted with how capricious, arbitrary, and really tragic the implications of evolution are for our species. To give one very simple but really moving example, iodine deficiency.
It causes goiter, of course, but it also causes cretinism in extreme cases, and also it shaves off between 10 to 15 IQ points from people who, when in the first trimester of pregnancy, when they don't get enough iodine from their mother's bodies.
Today, in the year 2020, we think about iodine deficiency as something that happens in exotic and far-off parts of the world. You may think of Mongolia. You may think of landlocked parts of Africa. You may think of Pakistan. All right? People are born mentally retarded and live their whole lives with a cognitive deficiency because of iodine deficiency. How is it possible for our species to be so poorly evolved? How is it possible for it to be natural and normal for this species of bipedal ape running around in the forest of North Africa to be reliant on seaweed, to be reliant on pregnant mothers eating seaweed during pregnancy just to prevent their children from being born mentally inadequate?
In some extreme cases, people are left with cretinism. More commonly, they have these 10 to 15 points shaved off their IQ, and that is irrecoverable. For the rest of their lives, that will be lost. About a third of people in the developing world don't get enough iodine. And 50 years from now, 60 years from now, those people, as adults, will have their capability impaired because we are not iodizing their salt today or providing iodine in other forms.
We have an evolved dependency on iodine that's irrational and arbitrary and unfair and tragic. And within recorded history, It was a problem on a vast scale within Europe too. White, wealthy people in Europe were born and raised iodine deficient on a massive scale. And medical scientists, kind of even in the medieval and Renaissance era, were struggling with this. They didn't understand why it was. Why was it that in these landlocked areas there were seemingly whole villages of people born mentally incapacitated, where the level of intelligence was so much lower than people living on the coast? And nobody knew why, and nobody knew what to do about it.
And in fact, the earliest time that this was actually noticed was in Switzerland, inland, where there were these villages of Cretans, where there were these villages where nobody got enough iodine, and everybody was running around, with substantially retarded. And these days, in some parts of the world, you do still come across these same kinds of villages. In China, a couple of times inland, in Gansu province and Ningxia, I came across what they call Shaguacun, which is precisely a village of dunces. And it is eerie to come across a village where everybody is substantially retarded because they don't get iodine.
How is it possible? It's possible because on a really deep level, nature is not some benevolent god or goddess that has set down for us an ideal for how we ought to live our lives. Nature did not create this world to be our playground, and did not create us to be a perfect plaything in that garden, if you like. All right? Nature has been cruel, capricious, arbitrary, indifferent. In many ways, nature put us into a situation where we couldn't win. And that's even just looking at the last 5,000 years, not going back millions of years of unbelievable suffering. So a guy like John Venus, who has many advantages in life, he's a very good-looking man. He has his whole career, basically, he has just gotten by on his looks. He doesn't have that kind of historical knowledge. He doesn't have that depth of understanding of human history, let alone the way evolution and nature in every sense of the world has interfaced with human history in those 5,000 years. A guy like John Venus looks at the world with a really deep assumption that whatever is natural must be necessary and fair and intended for our best, intended for our benefit. And that's the exact opposite of the truth. If you could really just think through and deal with just this one example, of course there are hundreds of examples, of how unfair it is that human beings should be born needing iodine and needing their pregnant mothers to eat enough iodine during the pregnancy, just so that we cannot be mentally handicapped for a whole life. Just really let that sink in and think about how unfair that is for a species that evolved in landlocked North Africa. Yes, eating, animals that resemble deer, four-legged quadruped. We did have a meat-eating diet, so on and so forth. Just what a ridiculous struggle we were put into that way, without even thinking through how unfair it is that there's this parasite called malaria, that all the terrible things we had to endure over a time scale of millions of years. Then you have to accept also that you're not going to find in that evolutionary record, you're not going to find in the examination of nature an ideal for what we ought to do, how we ought to live our lives now. All right? So John Venus has given up on ethical veganism because he resigned himself to this notion that meat eating is something natural and normal and necessary because of this evolutionary record, because of what he thinks of nature, what nature means to him here and now in our lives. I'm old enough at 41 that I met and knew people who lived through the Nazi period. And those people are not cartoon characters to me. They're not like caricatures of good or evil. Most of the people who actually lived through that period had all kinds of mixed and contradictory feelings about the Nazis as they rose and fell, and they worked with propaganda and very imperfect sources of information. I had one friend, and his grandparents laughed at Adolf Hitler. They thought Hitler was a complete joke kind of right up to the 11th hour, right up to when the news was coming out about how many millions of people were dying. And I can understand why. Still today, if you actually read what Hitler wrote, it's laughable, it's ridiculous. And these grandparents of his would stay up at night. I'd have to calculate the time zone difference. I believe it was on shortwave radio, maybe I misremember, but on radio, one way or another, in Canada, they would get broadcasts of the lectures Hitler was giving at that time to these big crowds in German. And they would laugh and laugh. It was just so ridiculous. One crazy crackpot conspiracy theory after another, blaming the Freemasons and saying this is a conspiracy and that. It was just so ridiculous that a leader in mainstream politics was speaking, in this way that from their perspective would not even be respectable if it were some crackpot at the local pub. They laughed and laughed, and then of course you can imagine after a certain point they had to look back and regret their laughter. All right? A lot of other people made the wrong call one way or another. The Prime Minister of Canada, it's on the record as an historical fact that he was a supporter of Adolf Hitler, even though he was the democratically elected Prime Minister of Canada and then ended up fighting against Hitler and so on. It's ridiculous. There were all kinds of people who wanted to think the best or misinterpreted what the signs were and later had to look back with regret that they were wrong. You know what you don't hear much about? You don't hear from people who initially supported Hitler and then found out the terrible truth and opposed Hitler and then decided later to go back to supporting Hitler anyway. That you don't hear about. That would take a remarkably evil character. Not just to initially support Hitler out of ignorance, but then to learn the terrible truth, oppose it, say morally this is bad and wrong and evil, and then to change your mind and decide that it's natural, normal, and necessary, or even good. The moral gap between vegans and ex-vegans is much deeper, much wider, and much more invidious than the gap between vegans and people who've simply eaten meat all their lives. That's not that big a deal. Like the gap between me as a vegan and someone who's just never thought about it, that's like the gap between someone who knows how terrible Hitler is during World War II and someone who's just living in ignorance. Someone who just doesn't know any of the facts. They only vaguely hear something on the news once in a while. They don't really know what's up, right? But when you encounter someone who has consciously and intentionally made the moral compromise that John Venus has made, not out of ignorance, knowing full well the ethical and ecological compromises, you are dealing with someone ethically worse than a Nazi, worse than a neo-Nazi. Someone who became a committed and ethical opponent of the Nazis, but who later changed their mind.